So now we come to our last speaker. We have Mr. Malaiz Daud. I know he doesn't like to be reminded of the fact that he was formerly Chief of Staff of Afghan, but he is also a scholar and a political analyst in his own right. So Malaiz, over to you. There's, I think, there is a presentation as well.
Thank you, Junaid. I had a different opening for my presentation, but then listening to Mayana and her statement on the emotional lifting that we have to do in occasions such as this one, as Afghans, after the collapse of the Republic last August, is immense. I went into a hibernation of 10 months before Junaid pulled me out of it and said, no, your job is to deal with hard, cold facts and give us an objective picture of what is going on in Afghanistan. But I also needed that time to retrospect, to reflect on what happened. So this presentation is one aspect of what I think went wrong. But before that, thank you, Junaid. Thank you, EFSAS colleagues. I also consider myself part of EFSAS ambassador. It's nice to see you again. You're here. And thank you for the new colleagues. So, the other end of history, can you move to the next slide, please? 1989 was a fateful year for Afghanistan because the last Soviet troops left the country, but it was also a fateful year for the world because the Berlin Wall fell. When it did, we had a seminal article by someone called Francis Fukuyama. That's his picture. He was a young political scientist, and he said the history had ended in the sense that liberal democracy was now not only in our consciousness, the most dominant, the undisputed value system, but at the same time, every country in the world, human civilization will move as the end state towards liberal democracy. And there was no doubt in his mind back then that this march towards democracy will proceed with some speed now. But in 2022, he has admitted that we are in a phase of democratic setback. Anyhow, how does this affect us? Next slide, please. If you look at our region, we are almost in a totalitarian region. In Afghanistan being one of the anocracies is a political lingo, a political science lingo, that means partial democracy. We were a partial democracy, Pakistan is a partial democracy, and then we have India as the biggest democracy. I'm discounting countries like Sri Lanka, Bhutan, because they're way far off and they have no influence in Afghanistan. But the countries of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, so on and so forth, who have influence in our country, they are totalitarian states, and then you have China, Russia, and all others. So in that region, the history may have ended, but not in the way Francis Fukuyama had foreseen it. And particularly after the Taliban takeover, there is definitely a setback. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that's my face. Think of it. Anyhow, and this is how the region sees the pullout of the international forces from Afghanistan. These two pictures were posted by the spokesman of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. The one picture that is really telling is the one brings hope, so they are providing humanitarian assistance in the wake of the earthquake, recent earthquake in Afghanistan, the Chinese. And the other one is obviously that infamous picture where the Afghans are trying to get on the military aircraft and leave the country. Next slide, please. Okay, now I have a different take, once again, because I deal with hard, cold facts as a political scientist. I have a different take on this end of history thesis of Fukuyama. What I believe is that in our region, the hybrid has won. When I say hybrid, it means that a state, for example, Pakistan military or part of state, partnering with a non-state actor, the Taliban, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and so on and so forth, and they not only defeated the Americans and their allies, but also on the right you see the last Soviet troops that withdrew. There, the Americans partnered with the Afghan Islamists and made the Soviet defeat possible. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the characteristics of the hybrid? Number one, they're partly state, partly non-state. So there is inbreeding between state and non-state. And that is the case, for example, with the Haqqanis and Pakistani military right now. I don't know if you've read this article by General McChrystal, who was the commander of his forces in Afghanistan, and he says it takes a network. That's exactly the name of the article, in which he says that they had to operate as a military force, as a network. They had to create a network of different actors, also non-state actors, to fight against a network. His analysis is okay, but what he gets wrong is that he believes that you can create the same kind of structure in fight, a structure that already has a lot of experience in fighting against big militaries. The third characteristic they have is they transcend national boundaries. Now, the region is not Westphalian. We have people from Kashmir here, we have, I guess, people from Pashtun regions of Pakistan. The boundaries are not clear, and that's a huge issue, and that's why these state and non-state actors justify their actions by saying we basically don't recognize any of the boundaries. They're self-sufficient and capable of reproduction. So if today you're a Haqqan network operator, tomorrow you're an ISIS, and the next year you're an Ansar Allah. They're very flexible and extremely resilient. And they're indiscriminate in getting resources. One day they'll be getting their resources from the Americans, the next day they will go to Chinese, they will get the resources from the Chinese. And obviously they're trying very hard to make sure that they offer what every entity wants them to offer. Okay, now the last point is important because, and many of the speakers touched upon this, in sociology we have some big thinkers, and they believe that our actions are influenced by the kind of cultural and political framework that we are brought in. Bourdieu, for example, calls it habitus. But some other theorists say that no, it's our actions that creates that kind of political, cultural framework, like Leftwich. He calls it the rules of the game. We set the rules of the game. Whereas Anthony Giddens talks about duality of the structure. So the structure influences our actions, but our actions in return influences how the structure operates. And that is the socio-economic, socio-political ecosystem is important to understand, particularly in the case of Taliban, with the creation of the first Deobandi madrasa and the proliferation of madrasa network across South Asia, and then at one point into Afghanistan around 8 years ago, particularly in places like Zormat and Ghazni, that laid the foundation for the extremism that Bashir was pointing at, that the new curriculum is going to create a lot of jihadists, and to bring us to the point where we have hardcore people whose single life goal is to serve the divine, to leave this world and make sure that he lands in the heaven. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the past, who has the Americans engaged? I've intentionally taken out West, so let's talk only about the Americans here. So initially during the jihad, the Afghan jihad of the 80s, 90s, it was the Islamists, and the result was a brutal war against the Soviets and their client state that destroyed the country, and then we ended up with a failed state and a civil war. And then before Taliban takeover, the second takeover, it was with the Islamists and the so-called technocrats. So these were like careerist development workers that were either based in the West or in countries like Pakistan, and they became the face of new progressive people, but they had no background in civil society, no background in mobilization, they had no grassroots support. So we ended up with a defective democracy. I'm being generous when I call it defective democracy, with a mafia weak state, and obviously it collapsed in 11 days. And now they're dealing with the Taliban. So even not now, when the US already signed the agreement with them, was it 2020? Anyhow, so we've ended up with a highly suppressive, discriminating religious autocracy. Violence is still pervasive, and this is something Taliban are trying to suppress, the information, the flow of information. Places like Panjshir, they're bleeding, and places like Andarat, they're bleeding. And obviously in the east, the kind of brutal war they're waging against the Salafists in places like Nangarhar and Kunar. And they're using a lot of tactics they have learned and taking the ISI in Pakistan. So they are despairing people and throwing their bodies in ditches and so on and so forth. And now we have the humanitarian crisis, probably around 20 million people are hungry every day. Next slide, please. So why? What is the problem? Why did they engage with these actors? Because it's simply fast and furious. When the Bush turned around to Pentagon, how long would it take them to attack Afghanistan? They said 6 months. He said, no, that doesn't work. So then they put 12 special forces and CIA operatives, landed them in Panjshir with $2 million, I guess, and said, okay, now do your thing, you know. So it's easy, but at the same time, the problem is you're suppressing you're not transforming, you're not changing anything. So you're just, what you're doing, you're suppressing the symptoms. And then you end up in a catch-22 situation, you know. So on the one hand, you're supporting, for example, you supported the warlords, but because they're violent, and violence is the only means of their livelihood, they will come back one day, just like the Taliban, the kind of situation they created, and then 9/11 happened. So it's a catch-22 situation, and it's always the back and forth. One day you're the friend, the other day you're the foe. One day you're the friend, the other day you're the foe. The final point is violence itself is inherently corrosive. It's destructive, psychologically, mentally, physically, socially, politically. So there's no positive side to it. Achieving peace through violence is antithesis. It cannot happen. Okay, next slide, please. What is the path forward? Gentlemen, please. I implore you. You know what? Take your time. Dig deep. There's this beautiful book by Vincent Ilanti, Deep Time Reckoning, where he's worked with nuclear scientists in Finland. These guys think of millions, hundreds of millions of years ahead. You take just your time in making decisions. Recognize Taliban, not recognize Taliban. You know, don't decide it now. Don't decide it today. Don't decide it next month. Take your time. All the short-term decisions we've made, and one of the results is that we are back to square one. You know, we are back to the top of that. So when I say infer, understand the temporal discrepancies between your time, like when Taliban was saying, oh, we have time, or you have watches, but we have time, you know? You know, try to see how our societies work, what kind of timelines we are looking at, and how you can adjust to those timelines. The second thing is, once you are aligning yourself with our realities, then you will have a very clear picture of, okay, what we should do in the future. Then, if this time you find the opportunity, please partner with organic grassroots movements. Support these movements, but not as your clients. Support them as your partners. Allow them, like us today here, to speak their minds, and I'm sure they will come up with the solutions. We have people from Pashtunta Protection Movement here, right? Like these guys, what they've done is they've stifled Taliban in North and South Waziristan. Probably the biggest cradle of the Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban. They stifled them through mass collective action, you know. Like if two Taliban appear, they will appear in huge numbers, you know. They gathered 20,000 people, 10,000 people in every meeting of theirs. So work with people like this. Work with people who face this head on, like their leader Manzoor Pashtun. Not people who take off without even wearing his shoes because he just heard some bullets fired in the background, talking about Ashraf. Next slide, please. Anyhow, so why? And I call this the other hybrid. Why non-violent movements? Number one, they are treating the cause and not the symptoms. So basically, the structures they create, these structures are premised on peace. They are premised on tolerance. In the future, you will see no problem from them. They take effective action, direct and indirect action. Direct and indirect action in the studies of nonviolence, like if you protest against someone's direct action. But if you create an alternative school, like Khan Abdul Khan created the Azad School Network, that's why you have mobilization in that region, that's indirect action. If you have an alternative program of awareness, that's indirect action. And they're not, the other good thing is they're not treating people as enemies. They're treating their words and deeds as enemies. And that's very transformative. That's reconciliatory. In the future, that is going to create an environment that will not be conducive for violence and extremism. Finally, it's sustainable. Like what we created in Afghanistan in the past 20 years was not sustainable. It was not premised on nonviolence. It was premised on violence. Whereas nonviolence in their studies, tons of them, both qualitative and quantitative, in the aftermath of nonviolent conflict, you have more open political systems, they're more inclusive, and they're more democratic. That's the more stable. Okay? No, I think I'm already done. Okay. So yeah, so some of the consequences I already mentioned. The other thing is, one of the problems we suffered immensely from by our rulers in the past 20 years, they were not modest. And that's why they kept asking for more rent. Whereas the nonviolent movements are very modest. They're self-reliant. They're averse to oppression and extremism, not only by others, but also by themselves, their own leaders. As I said, they're effective in stifling extremist and violent tendencies, like the example of PTM, and we have very strong nonviolent movement in Kashmir. And finally, they create safe spaces and inclusive structures. Why are we talking about girls' education in Afghanistan in 2022? Because we don't have anyone to stand up there. We have a few women who stood up there, but they are golden. But imagine if with these 30 women, you had 20,000 people standing. Taliban would have never dared to crack down on them. Next slide, please. So the result would be a few partnered with nonviolent movements. They would shrink spaces and resources for terrorism, which would in turn dissuade outward migration. And they will in the future, and PTM leader and so many other Pashtuns from the Pakistani side of the Dual line, they talk about this impending new great game between China and the US. And they're a natural ally of the Western world because they're inherently liberal, inherently inclusive, inherently tolerant. So they're your natural allies. Focus on them. But once again, deep time reckoning, Think deep, take your time, don't make any rash decisions. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you.
Thank you, Malaiz. As mentioned to you earlier, I made up for the previous time where you had less time. You spoke the longest, so I made up for that.